Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am Javier Gutierrez, and it is my privilege to welcome you to today's presidential lecture. I would also like to welcome those joining us live from around the world. Before we begin, as a reminder, please note that interpretation is available in the 3 official languages of the WTO via the earpieces provided at each seat in the council room. To begin with today's program, I would like to invite the WTO Director General, Dr. Ngosio Konjiwela, to introduce our guest of honor. Madam Director General, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Javier. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this 5th installment in our WTO Presidential Lecture Series. We set up this platform to bring some of the world's leading thinkers and policymakers here to the WTO to share their visions for the pressing challenges of our time and offer practical ideas for the way forward. I'm particularly honored and delighted to welcome today's speaker, His Excellency President Charles Michel, President of the European Council. He will be speaking on the role of the multilateral trading system in a world of multiple crises and emerging challenges. Crises, challenges, and trade are all familiar territory for President Michel, who has been a pivotal figure in European and global politics for many years. He helped steer the European Union through the COVID-19 pandemic and remains at the center of the EU's efforts to reshape its role on the world stage as it seeks to navigate a rapidly changing geopolitical and economic environment. Through it all, he has remained vocally committed to multilateralism, peace, and shared prosperity for people across Europe and around the world. President Michel's journey has taken him from politics in Wallonia to the highest echelons of European leadership. The complexities of Belgian political life might lie at the origin of his deep-rooted belief in the power of cooperation and the ability of very different groups to find workable solutions. But these are beliefs that resonate strongly with us here at the WTO. Against the backdrop of today's tensions around international trade, President Michel's insights will be particularly timely. He understands, as we do, that trade is not a means in itself, or even solely an engine of greater productivity and growth, but that trade is a force for social inclusion, economic development, environmental sustainability, and yes, peace. I've known President Michel since before I competed for this job at the WTO. I first became aware of him as a strong friend of Africa, someone who is deeply conscious of Europe's role with respect to the continent. And Mr. President, I want to thank you for your support for the WTO from the get-go, and also for me personally since day one. I'm grateful for your commitment to building a fairer and more inclusive international system, one marked by less lecturing, as you just recently said, and more understanding and trust among nations. President Michel is known for his deep appreciation for literature, particularly his admiration of the work of Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer who wrote movingly about Europe's early 20th century. Zweig warned how stability and prosperity could in short order be replaced by brutality and despair. His wisdom echoes loudly today at a time when the progress we've worked so hard to achieve could be undermined by fragmentation and nationalism. We cannot afford to let the world of cooperation and integration that we've built over the past 80 years, a world that, despite everything in the news today, has offered more people better lives than an earlier era. Joining what Zweig called the world of yesterday. This is not a defense of the status quo, no. We must use trade as a tool to bring more people and places left out of the gains of recent decades. We need to admit that not everyone benefited from those gains. But the issue is, how do we use this tool to bring them a better life, bringing them into the global economic mainstream? Our collective efforts to reform and update the WTO are part of making the trade work for everyone. I'm proud of what members, ambassadors here are doing in that regard. President Michel is not just a committed multilateralist. He's committed to ensuring that multilateralism delivers results for people and the planet. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, President Michel, on the future of the multilateral trading system. Even if I don't expect to agree with everything he says, I always tease him that the EU is a complex animal, and you can't always agree. They are quite a tough animal to deal with sometimes. Before I hand over to our guest, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the dedicated efforts of all those who have made this event possible. The WTO Secretariat team, particularly the Knowledge Management Section and Information and External Relations Division, our interpreters and my own office. I want to especially thank President Michel's Chief of Staff and my Chief of Staff who managed to put this together at short notice. Before closing, I would also like to show appreciation for our members who have always supported and participated in this series. I know you're all very busy, and it's a delight to see so many of you ambassadors here this morning. I also appreciate the support of our colleagues from the Geneva diplomatic and academic community. So now, let me, as I always say, shut up and hand over the podium to His Excellency President Charles Michel.
Dear Director General Okonjo, dear Ngozi, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the world is on a knife edge. War and conflict are piercing the heart of our multilateral system and our global confidence. Russia's war against Ukraine, the war in Gaza, and the crisis in the Middle East, without forgetting the terrible civil war in Sudan. These conflicts and others are creating a devastating cocktail of humanitarian catastrophes, destabilization, and insecurity, and driving the world away from the rule of law towards the law of force. They've put our rules-based order on life support. And on top of this, every week, all of us, we can see the devastating effects of climate change worldwide, from Typhoon Yagi in Southeast Asia and raging wildfires in Canada to the terrible flash floods in Spain this week. We are also living through the mind-blowing revolution of artificial intelligence, with its vast potential in terms of innovation, productivity, but also its risks for human rights, democracy, and our global trading system. And one thing is absolutely certain. No country alone, even the most powerful, can face all these challenges. We need cooperation, we need multilateralism more than ever. And to make multilateralism work, I think that we need the 3 T's: trust, trade, and transform. We need to build more trust. People must believe in each other when they make agreements and work together. And building trust requires respect for international law, crucial when nations cooperate together. We also need trade, because it generates prosperity and helps us achieve our common goals. And we must transform global multilateral institutions so they are strong and fit for the 21st century. The 3 T's are precisely what we try to use in the European Union. And you know, the EU is founded on trust between member states and grounded in our shared laws, values, and accountability. And this trust allows us to cooperate and reach compromise on difficult issues that were once taboo. And trade has been a central pillar of our European Union since the days of the European Coal and Steel Community creating our single market and customs union got rid of trade barriers and got goods, services, people, and capital flowing freely across borders. We have transformed Europe from a continent divided by war to a continent working together across countless sectors. And as we speak, we are building brick by brick our European sovereignty, trying to reduce our overdependence and building mutually beneficial partnerships with the rest of the world. We want to build bridges, not barriers, and that requires more trust, more dialogue, more mutual understanding between nations and people, and less polarization that drives nations apart. I strongly believe in a multipolar world where each country or group of countries can set its own path with respect for the common rules. It should not be about choosing one side over another. And that's why I think we need to listen, we need to cooperate, and we need to forge common decisions based on smart compromise. And we have to develop what I call our collective intelligence for solving collective problems. Just one example, the EU, together with regional blocs, with other regional blocs, we played a crucial role in successfully negotiating the Pact for the Future in New York. It was not about ideology. It was not about North versus South or East versus West. It was about common sense. It was about the four corners of the globe coming together for an agreement that's good for everyone. And I hope this sets a good example for reforming our international financial system, the Bretton Woods institutions. We need to make international financing fairer and more inclusive. The financial firepower of multilateral development banks like the World Bank must be scaled up, and you can count on the EU to be a leader for change. And before we start that part of the meeting, we're discussing the importance to help the countries to invest, also by addressing the challenge of de-risking, which is probably one of the main priorities we need to work on in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, the world needs trust and the world needs trade. And that's why we, all of us, we are so fortunate to have a natural trust builder like you, Ngozi, at the helm of the WTO. Dear Ngozi, I would like to commend you on your tireless efforts. And I remember, for instance, your critical work during the COVID pandemic on vaccines and intellectual property, to name just a few. Today, a dark cloud of distrust hangs over international cooperation. And that's why I also want to pay tribute to your relentless determination to bring trust back to the heart of the WTO. And I can tell you, as President of the European Council, and indeed the EU is a strange political animal, I can confirm. As President of the European Council, I know very well how hard it is to make decisions with only 27 member states, so I do not underestimate your challenge in making decisions with 160 WTO members. I am very modest and humble here. Ladies and gentlemen, we must pursue the necessary reforms to make the WTO a powerful force for the 21st century. And you are doing precisely that, because these reforms are about rebuilding trust, because trade is about trust. When people trade, they trust each other, and when they trust each other, they build new projects together for the future. And that's why we support the strengthening of the WTO. This is a strategic choice of the EU. A strong, well-functioning WTO is essential to fair and predictable global trade. Trade is the engine of multilateralism. Trust is the petrol powering the engine. And transformation is the movement to our destination, an effective and modernized multilateralism. That's why we need to transform and reform our multilateral institutions, starting with the WTO, reforming the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, including an effective appeals process, is a top priority. The EU and most G20 members support ambitious reform. while keeping the core principles agreed in 1995, and this includes the right of appeal to an impartial decision-making body. The clock is ticking, let's get it done. We must also address unfair subsidies and state support and make the process more inclusive. Both developed and developing countries should have their say. We must modernize the system so it fosters cooperation over confrontation, interdependence over isolation, and rules over war power. The EU also supports plurilateral negotiations within the WTO because we think this is an effective complement to multilateral negotiations. Plurilateral negotiations foster innovation and allow countries to move forward on specific issues like digital trade or environmental goods, and this also builds trust and creates momentum for future cooperation. A very good example is the investment facilitation for development agreed by 128 countries. Our rules-based order, ladies and gentlemen, is much more than a technical framework. It is our collective and human-centered vision for peace, stability, and shared prosperity. As the world is increasingly divided into blocks, the multilateral trading system is a powerful anchor of stability and a motor for prosperity. Our multilateral trade system must be fair for big and for small countries alike. Every country must have a fair shot at growing and thriving in the global economy. And that's why a level playing field is crucial to ensuring that common rules and standards apply to everyone. Our trade relationship should be anchored in a spirit of cooperation and shared goals. And that's why I sincerely think that imposing values or principles without dialogue doesn't work and will never work. This is a recipe for distrust and resistance. And I would like to give an example. The EU's deforestation law. This is an interesting example. We have good intentions. I can explain what are the good intentions we have. But we have listened to our partners and we've understood it was better to postpone the phasing in time of this legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, after 10 years as a member of the European Council, I have learned at least 3 key lessons for the future. First, when regions cooperate more, the world cooperates more. And this strengthens the United Nations and our multilateral system. And that's why in the EU we have tried to strengthen our ties with all major regional organizations in the last years, like the African Union, ASEAN, CELAC, and with the Gulf countries, for instance. Second, we must be true to our beliefs always and everywhere. Double standards are a poison in the bloodstream of international cooperation. The law is the law, and we must defend it wherever it is threatened. And these laws must be decided by everyone, so they are legitimate, and implemented by everyone, so they are universal. No cherry picking. And that's why you are not surprised that myself and the European Council, we fully support UN Secretary General Guterres and the work of the United Nations. He is the guardian of our rules-based multilateral system. Labeling him as persona non grata is totally unacceptable. And third lesson, this is the importance of trust. With more trust, we can prevent tensions and conflict. With more trust, we can solve problems and build future projects together. Ladies and gentlemen, we're building trust, boosting trade, and transforming our multilateral institutions, the 3 T's, trust, trade, transform. This is how I think we will make the world more peaceful and more prosperous. You can count on the European Union. I thank you.
Once again, a round of applause to our lecturer. Good morning, Excellencies, Director General of the WTO, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. My name is Ambassador Professor Muhammadu Ka, the Gambian Ambassador to the WTO. It is indeed an honor to welcome you, Your Excellency, Charles Michel, to our WTO Presidential Lecture Series. Excellencies, we gather here today at a very critical juncture in a world where crises, whether economic, health-related, environmental, or geopolitical, are increasingly interconnected and urgent, as articulated by our lecturer today. Excellency, on behalf of my colleague Excellencies, we thank you for your very insightful, thoughtful, and brilliant lecture. The insights and challenges you shared underscores an undeniable truth. In today's globalized world, cooperation and coordinated actions are not merely desirable, they are essential, and yes, quite imperative. And we've heard you, the point you made about the fact that the world needs trust, respect for international law when we cooperate, as well as trade being the engine of multilateralism is well noted. As your moderator, I'm both humble and energized to guide today's fire chat, knowing that we stand at a crossroads that you underscored severally in your lecture. As you pointed out, the global economy faces unprecedented pressure from climate change, from food insecurity and economic disparity to shifting geopolitical dynamics and rapid technological transformation, which you also underscored on your lecture. We appreciate your perspectives that in this complex landscape, the WTO's role as a guardian of open, rules-based trade and the centrality of trust has never been more vital. Indeed, your lecture brings together very insightful perspectives that promises to inspire fresh ideas and practical solutions for our consideration here in this sacred hall to reinvigorate our efforts and commitment to strengthen the global trading frameworks and systems as we charge forward towards MC 14. We thank you once again for being here, and ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, let us now begin to our very vital conversation. I have very few questions, Mr. President, and I expect our Director General to also share her thoughts on those questions. Mr. President, the first question we have is, how do you see the prospects of global cooperation and the future of international trade in an evolving world exposed to a rise in economic nationalism and beggar thy neighbor policies? Your Excellency.
No, thank you. And once again, it's a great pleasure to be with you this morning and to have this exchange of views and to interact. And the first point I would like to say is the following. The European Union, we strongly believe that trade is a powerful tool to fight against poverty and to improve the prosperity all across the world. Is our basic principle. And the history of the EU is founded on this idea that if we cooperate more, including the field of trade, we can make more progress. We need to meet point two is the first element. Point two, we can see that we face an extraordinary difficult situation at the geopolitical level, because we can see that the foundations of the UN Charter are attacked, including by countries that have a special responsibility to protect the international law by being member of the Security Council of the United Nations. And we can see at the same time that there is more and more disappointment in some parts of the world, because there is not only an impression, this is a reality. There's this idea that the multilateral system is not really inclusive, and it does not reflect today's reality. The world today is not the world like it was the case a few decades ago. And that's why I sincerely believe if we want to rebuild trust, it's important that all the countries, all the nations reaffirm our sincere belief in the international law, in the international principles, but that we address together the common challenges. And what are the common challenges? On the one hand, we can see that we face a radical transformation of our economic paradigm. Climate change means that it's not possible anymore to abuse the natural resources. Climate change is showing that what was seen in the past as a waste is becoming a resource, an economic resource. At the same time, the digital revolution and the transformation through the artificial intelligence is showing that data becomes more and more fundamental economic resources for the future. And you have to see how we can manage to make a successful transition which is fair, which is just, and how we can make sure that this global dialogue is delivering a result. And it's my last point. I sincerely think that if we want to be successful, it's important to show that we are successful, at least in some topics. We are identifying some concrete priorities where we think we can deliver, because this is not enough to talk, to express a sincere and generous principles. We have to show that the decisions we make, it has an effect, it makes a difference for the people who are expecting us not only to talk, to meet, but also to make decisions that have and that will have a profound impact on their daily life.
Thank you. Insightful. Madam President, your thoughts.
I think you're promoting me. I'm just a mere Director General. Before I speak, I do want to recognize the presence of the chair of our General Council, Ambassador Peter Olberg. I had not seen him when I was, but thank you for being here. Just some quick thoughts. I share the thoughts that His Excellency, Mr. President Charles Michel has said. But I do want to say it's inevitable, some of the problems we face on the global front, we have no choice but to cooperate. You said it, and I want to repeat it. No one can solve some of these issues, no one country, no one member. Climate change, pandemics, these are issues, just to name a few. Food insecurity. It's always very startling to me that 1 in 4 calories consumed today in the world is traded. So we can't really have food security without trade. These are problems in which we need to cooperate with each other. But that being said, I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that there are people who are disaffected in the world, who feel they've not benefited from the system and somehow they've been cheated out of it. So if we are to also encourage cooperation, we have to find a way to listen to the sentiments of those who feel left behind, who feel disaffected, and then try to figure out how do we include them. Because their views are also having an impact on a national level, on the way that national politics is conducted. So I'm very, very conscious and worried about addressing those who feel left out. And I feel that trade can still be an investment, an instrument for including those. How do we direct investment to those parts of our countries and those parts of the world that were left out and didn't benefit from the first wave of globalization? That's why we're so fond of this notion of re-globalization at the WTO, an instrument, whether it's in a rich country where you now need to redirect investment into poor regions and sort out the problems of poor people who are not included or people out of jobs. I just want people to know that trade is not about taking away jobs. It's about creating jobs. And if areas have been left out, we need to consciously have policy that redirects jobs to those areas. So that's one thing. We need to breed the atmosphere where our populations can support us to cooperate and collaborate. And then I just want to end on the note of saying we need to look for where, just as you said, President Michel, where the opportunities lie. You know, I was on a program last night, I think it was Richard Quest, and then, he said to me, trade is a dirty word these days. And I said, absolutely not. You can't have trade be a dirty word when 75% of what makes us tick is from trade. 75% of world trade is going on today on WTO terms, and people just assume they can walk into their shop or their store or wherever it is and pick up an item without wondering how did it get there, and what if it did? What if I don't get it? So we've come to take trade so for granted that we are neglecting the good parts of it. And I think it can be a very solid part of answering the problems we have today, providing new solutions, and being used as an inclusive instrument. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Director General.
I think Mohammed wants to promote me today.
Mr. President, from your long and diverse experience on so many issues, how do you assess the relationship between the European Union and Africa regarding the revamped Economic Partnership Agreement? In addition to that question, how do you see the relationship between the European Union and the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific region, the ACP, in terms of the long-term strategic partnerships to support the legitimate economic and social transformation of those regions? Your Excellency.
No, you will not be surprised that I am a big supporter of much more cooperation between the EU and the African continent, because I think that you have a common future, and I think that we have the same dreams, we have the same hopes for the future. We want peace, we want stability, and we want prosperity. We want to improve the conditions of life of our people, and we share the same goals, and that's why I've tried the last years to use my position to strengthen the ties between the EU and the African continent. And I remember a few years ago when we had the last summit between the African Union and the European Union in Brussels, we made bold decisions. And the starting point is this idea that we want partnerships based on the idea that we have common interests. We want to support much more the role that is supposed to be played by the private sector, more investments. And I think there is a very important challenge for the African countries. It's related to the fact that many of those countries, they face at the same time climate change and the fight against poverty. And we should not ask them to make a choice between the fight against poverty and climate change. And they need to invest to be in a position to transform their countries and to meet the aspirations of the population. And here I see the link with what you said just before, the importance to take into account the reality of the world and the importance to reform the Bretton Woods institutions. I remember a few years ago, together with Emmanuel Macron at the youth level, we decided to start a dialogue with African friends, especially with African friends, but not only with African friends, about the special dwelling rights and this idea that we had to reallocate those special dwelling rights. We made some progress, this is good, but it's not enough. We need much more than that. If I am not mistaken, the World Bank is 7 times less capitalized, if I take into account the GDP, in comparison with the period when this World Bank was launched. It shows the weakness. It shows that we have to increase the financial power of those multilateral development banks. If I am not mistaken, I think that I am not wrong, I say that the most fragile African countries, when they want to have access to the capital, is 7 times more expensive than a country like Germany. This is a problem that we need to address. I'm not saying it's easy to solve this question, but we should have the political will to discuss seriously, to discuss concretely what concrete modalities we need to address that question. And finally, in terms of security and stability, let me share with you an experience. You know, I'm one of those on the EU side who have tried to play a role to support all the efforts to fight the terrorism in the Sahel region. And remember that the EU, together with others, we have tried to launch initiatives When I see the situation today, I can see that we are all disappointed because we can see that the security is not guaranteed, not at all. We can see that the conditions of life for the people in that region is extremely difficult. On the other hand, I've seen another approach. It was a different approach, based also on another form of cooperation between the EU and some African countries in Mozambique. And I can see how, together with a country like Rwanda and the SADC countries, we have followed another approach, where in fact we have decided to trust the countries in the region to address these security challenges. It means that we have also to learn the lessons, to see what works, what doesn't work, and if we follow the same practice, we should not be surprised that there is the same result, and that's sometimes it's good to assess what we do and to think what can we do in a better way. I'm giving this example, why? Because I think it for sure the African countries, they are responsible for the stability, for the security, for the prosperity, and the EU, we are ready to support, to help, but based on the priorities which have to be fixed in Africa by the African people and by the African countries.
Mr. President, can you also share some thoughts on the Caribbean and the Pacific region quickly?
You know, this is a very important region for the European Union, and we have tried to strengthen the ties with those countries, and we can see that we have a lot in common, because in that region, those countries understand very well that promoting the international law, this is extremely important. They understand very well that tackling climate change is not something which is theoretical. This is very real for that region, and that's why we intend to intensify the support, the cooperation with that part of the world. We try also to understand what are the concrete expectations they have towards us, and we try in a very respectful way to bring effective solutions so that we can work more together in the future.
Thank you. Madam Director General.
Thank you. I want to pose a bit of a provocative challenge to His Excellency, if you will. You know, Europe is Africa's largest trading partner. And what we are finding at the WTO is that there are very generous arrangements from many partners to allow goods from either the Pacific, Caribbean, or African countries into these markets. Europe has everything but arms. America has the AGOA. And there are other arrangements from other countries that are quite generous. But just taking the EU and Africa, I did some work with my staff some months ago, just when I was going to give a talk in Berlin, to see what the benefits of trade and all the partnership agreements have been. And I found that they've not really materially increased trade between the EU and Africa. And if you look at numbers, you find least developed countries that have all these benefits are still 0.5% of world trade. Africa is 3.3% and less and has stagnated. So that leads to a bit of skepticism about these partnership agreements and all these open access. Are they really working? Why is it that we haven't seen an increase in the value of trade between these two regions? So I wanted to be a bit provocative. Some of it may have to do with the fact that sometimes we have the access, but then there are other requirements that have to do with barriers to trade that may be technical barriers, there may be other barriers, types of barriers that come up that don't allow access. So this question is posed to me many times by many developing countries. How come we are not seeing an increase in our share if we have all these opportunities? So I wanted to be a bit provocative and pose it to you also and say, what can we do better to make sure that these arrangements all result in greater trade and greater real access for these for the countries? Sorry to be so long-winded, but you know.
President.
No, thank you for being provocative. In fact, we share this impression that we do not have the full benefit of those agreements, and we think that indeed should be done to make sure that the full potential is accessible and is possible for those countries when they benefit from those agreements. But I remember, for instance, that we have worked very, very hard with countries like Kenya and like some others in that region to make those agreements possible on the one hand, and then to see what are the concrete obstacles, what are the difficulties, and what can we do so that the African businesses, they have access to the single market. But I can tell you that on the EU side, we are extremely sincere with this idea that our interest is more prosperity in Africa, more growth in Africa, more economic development in Africa. Because we understand very well that if this is not the case, this is not good for the African people, this is not good for the European people, this is obvious. And it's why we also support the efforts by the African Union to try to develop a single market in Africa, a free market in Africa. And we do not underestimate all the challenges because the African Union, the African countries, this is huge, more than 54, I think, countries. That's why we also think that the regional organization can play an interesting role on the African continent to make steps for more economic integration. It could be a first step. And we remember that at the European Union's level, the starting point was the Benelux, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. We started to put in place a modest regional cooperation, and then it became an inspiration for the rest of the European Union. And in the same vein, we think that some regional organizations, and we know that there are various realities in terms of regional organization in Africa, but we think that there is a potential to improve the integration on the African continent, and we think that this cooperation with the EU could be also a good leverage to encourage more regional integration at economic level on the African continent. I certainly believe that is the future and it's a choice made by the African leaders. This is a purpose decided by the African leaders.
Thank you, Mr. President. One of the most important emerging issues is climate change and the need to better include mitigation and adaptation measures into the trade policy formulation. How do you see the role of the WTO and its membership in addressing climate change and sustainability measures? And what kind of flexibilities do you foresee for the developing and least developing countries in this regard?
You are absolutely right that climate change is a main challenge and a very difficult one. And you know that 5 years ago, in December, it will be exactly 5 years ago, the European Union, we made a very important decision. In fact, when we decided that we had the ambition to make Europe the first neutral continent by 2050. It was a very strong decision. And I remember a few weeks or a few months before we made the decision, there was a lot of skepticism around the EU, and not everyone was absolutely convinced it was the right choice. And we also knew that at the international level, it would have an effect if the EU would make such a decision. And we have seen in the years following the decision that it has. And it had a certain impact on some of the countries and regions across the world. Is my first point. My second point, it means that on the EU side, you are looking at the rest of the world with this idea that you have to develop what we call the climate diplomacy. We need to talk to the rest of the world, to discuss, to listen, and to see how we can work together and to cooperate together. And it has an impact on the way we are looking at trade. Because sometimes, I'm very honest with you, sometimes I have the impression that in Europe, they would like to use trade as a tool to resolve all the problems of the world. And to see that through trade agreements, we can even impose to the rest of the world to follow exactly the same principles, standards, and reality that you have in Europe. I am not naive. I think it's not a good idea, not realistic. And I think that we should identify what are the top priorities through the trade agreement. More prosperity, this is what you highlighted, and this is absolutely correct. More economic development, more benefit. We thought for getting the most vulnerable countries, point one. But at the same time, we think that trade could be a useful tool to tackle climate change. If we discuss seriously what are the common environmental standards and how we can make sure that there is a fair transition, that we take into account the starting points, the realities. And here you know that the EU, we are very active in the framework of the G20, but we play a leading role to put in place what we call the Just Energy Transition Partnership. These are concrete frameworks to work with some countries, South Africa, Vietnam, and many other countries in the world, to be concrete, to be operational, to assess what is the starting point, what is the economic reality, what is the industrial reality, and what can we do to make sure that there are more investment, that we can follow the right path. And then one last comment on this important topic. We made a choice in Europe, and we see that not all the world is following us, but we think that carbon pricing is a good tool to have an impact and to change our behaviors. And we accept that we have to be realistic, that the transition should be fair and that it takes time. We accept this principle. But we can see that some other important regions across the world, they follow another path by using subsidies to try to encourage their businesses to invest in the green technologies. And that's why we need this global dialogue. We think that the WTO is a very good and important platform to have this dialogue. In a nutshell, I would say, if I would be alone, I'm not alone, this is clear, but if I would be alone, I would focus on two priorities. I would try to use this WTO rules and principles to support more efforts in the field of the fight against climate change, and also to make some progress in terms of social rights. These are two important elements. Certainly there are other elements that are important, but those elements, in my opinion, should be priorities.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Director General, your thoughts?
Well, I think that first of all, we just need to let it sink in that climate change is an existential threat. It's with us every day, and so I think the most important thing is to focus on what instruments we have and how can they be most useful in trying to help us fight climate change. And certainly I think that trade and the WTO rules have a role to play with respect to trying to lower carbon emissions and getting to net zero. I think the first thing is to say that there are many members who are already of the WTO taking interesting action. And actually, as I move around and listen to what some of the countries are doing and look at examples, we decided this year to try and talk to our members to see if we could share experiences in what they are doing, because often one country doesn't know the best practice by the other. So first of all, I want to say I'm proud of what members are doing. We found some really good examples within the EU, US, developing countries, emerging markets, and hopefully we can share some of those examples of how our members are trying to work with climate change. Beyond that, I'm a strong believer that trade has a really important role. I actually think it's essential. And we said this in our World Trade Report and in other areas. There's absolutely no way you're going to fight climate change without trade. We need open, free, fair, and predictable global multilateral trading system to get technologies from where they are made to where they are needed. Not every member, every country in the world will be able to have access to the necessary tools with which to fight. If we don't have trade, how are they going to get them? So I think that and the WTO's core mission of keeping open, fair, and predictable, stable markets is very important. Second, I think we ought to rethink and reimagine trade. With climate change, comparative advantages are changing. And I really want to promote what our chief economist, Ralph Osser, calls green comparative advantage. Comparative advantage of countries are changing. Some have the comparative advantage to produce the green goods that we need, whether it's green energy or the critical minerals that will be needed to power our systems going forward. And so how do we switch the way we trade and the way we value, we create and produce products to take advantage of that green comparative advantage. Why are we trying to transport green hydrogen from one place to the other when it's not that easy? Why not make the products where you produce that energy? And that could be in developing countries, Central Asia, Latin America, Africa, and transport those. All this requires trade. I could go on and on. Don't ask me, because I'm very enthusiastic about this subject. And of course, on carbon pricing, the problem we need to avoid is where we have this fragmented approach with every member or every country having their own system without any interoperability. We cannot stop members doing what they want to do. But the issue is, how do we make life easier for business people? Because they're the ones who trade. When they go to this EU, they see CBAM. They go to another country, they see this. They go to the UK, they see something. They go to, maybe Brazil, they see something. It's impossible. We need to think of an approach not to take away from them what they're doing, that's their sovereign decision, but to make the systems interoperable so that we can have a common way of measuring what the carbon price is, or if you're using subsidies or regulations, what does that really amount to? Particularly for poor, small, developing countries who may not have the capacity to mount an approach of their own. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Madam Director General. I know you're very passionate about this topic. Mr. President, with the emergence of fragmentation and geopolitical disruptions, how can the WTO ensure that trade remains a driver for peace, for prosperity, and for development? Your Excellency.
I'm absolutely convinced that what will be important is to demonstrate that the WTO is important to make agreements, and that's why I do not underestimate all the efforts that are needed to demonstrate we can make agreements. And I know that the dispute settlement mechanism is an important element, and that's why in all international formats, when you have the occasion, the EU is advocating, and we try to convince those we need to convince to make sure that we can make progress in that field, because it will be the demonstration that despite all the difficulties, we try to agree on some basic principles, some basic elements to rebuild trust. This is one first element. And the second element, I think many challenges are interlinked. And when I was talking about the lack of trust and the terrible consequences, it has consequences everywhere. If I take the example of climate change and what we just discussed, the interoperability between some carbon pricing systems, if there is a lack of trust, we are not in a position to make interoperable system that allow us to make progress all together. If the developing countries they have the impression that the western part of the world is using or abusing the environmental standards to force them to follow some approaches they don't want to follow, then there is a lack of trust, and this is a vicious circle. And we should break this vicious circle by talking to each other, by identifying what is the common basis, what are the common goals, and how we can put in place concrete modalities to make some progress. And that's why, I don't want to repeat myself, but I think that the financial architecture is an important topic. It's not possible anymore not to look at this question. Why? Because we can express generous intentions, we can be very sincere. If you are not in a position to address the financial question, the financial topic, then we are not in a position to make progress, to tackle climate change, and to resolve this change. And you're absolutely right. When you said this existential. And I can tell you that probably 5 years ago, 10 years ago, in Europe, there were doubts. Not everyone was convinced it was existential. But today, every week, we can see what are the consequences on all continents of this climate change challenge. We need to change, to transform our economic paradigm. Trade is a powerful tool to improve the prosperity all across the world, to address this climate change issue, this climate change, and trade is also a very powerful tool to make sure that the people, they trust each other. And if we trust each other in the field of trade, it could facilitate also the possibility to resolve some geopolitical tensions. And we remember this is the history of humanity when regions, when municipalities, when in the past they had the possibilities to trade and to trust each other. Very often it was a starting point for building other projects, more ambitious projects for the future.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Director General.
I think Mr. President has answered it well. I don't need to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. President, based on your excellent track record of negotiations and building coalitions, what advice could you offer us here at the WTO and its membership on our own negotiations? And how do you see the future of the WTO, and what reforms are required to make the WTO fit for purpose in this evolving world?
Comme ça? Okay. No, I think that I don't need to give any advice. Maybe this is the opposite. I need advice. But having said that, look, you know, the EU is an extraordinary political project because we have 27 member states which made the decision to work closely together and to identify some common priorities. And there's something, in my opinion, which is important, is my experience at the EU's level, but also in Belgium. And Belgium is not the most simple country across the world, as you know. It is very important to listen actively to the other opinion, because you may have your own certainties, your own convictions, but it's always extremely important to try to understand, even if you not share the convictions on the other side, that you listen so that you try to understand what are the fundamental reasons for another opinion, for another choice, because this is a starting point for making compromise possible. And on the other hand, I sincerely believe in what I call the collective intelligence. I think that we are smarter when we are ready to accept the idea that you are not right by being alone. And this is very important to accept that some other part of the world, they have other traditions, other approaches, and it can strengthen the decision you forge. That's why listening actively is the first step, I think, before being in a position to propose something that sometimes needs to be a bit innovative, so that we can rally the broad support and we can make those collective decisions to resolve collective problems. This is one first element. And second element, I sincerely think that if we want to rebuild trust, that we need to be very clear that we do not accept double standards. And I think this is the poison at the international level today, because there can be this impression sometimes that some countries, some regions, they have their assessment of the international law in some cases, and they make another interpretation in other cases. And then we lose the credibility, and we lose a certain authority. And this is, I think, a serious risk for the international community. I think that if we agree on some fundamental principles, the UN Charter, human rights, human dignity, this is very important that we follow the same principles always and everywhere. If not, we lose the credibility. And if we lose the credibility, we lose the possibility to be trusted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Director General.
Again, I think I'll rest. It's very wise words. I'm the least qualified to advise on how to improve negotiations at the WTO. We are trying, that's all I can say. I think one of the elements is never to give up, always to try to forge a way, find a way forward, because the issues are too important.
Thank you, Madam Director General. Excellencies, can we give our distinguished guest and Madam Director General a round of applause? that ends the segment of the questions to Mr. President. Now I turn to you, Your Excellencies, for interventions from the floor. Before I open it up to the floor, I have some ambassadors that requested the floor. Ambassador Pitfield of Thailand, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I'm very great honor to be the first speaker to speak from the floor. First of all, let me give my sincere thanks to DG for the initiative, and also my thanks for also the Secretariat. I think we are running short of time, so I will have my questions posted for the President. I'm from Thailand, by the way, sorry. Yeah. We have heard you mentioning about priorities of the EU, and climate change is one of them. And also that is something that we should have during the reform. My question would be that how best can the international organizations and the multilateral economic cooperation, do more support for achieving the SDG goals in terms of sustainable development, and make it trade and development and environment protection mutually supportive. So that would be my question. Actually, I was preparing to ask. I was very intrigued by your mentioning about the 3 T's, the trust, the trade, and the transform, where you said that trade is the engine, and trust is the petrol, and transform is the action, but we are lacking the good petrol at the moment, meaning trust. So with your experience, maybe you can elaborate a little bit better how to make the petrol more acceptable to all, so the engine, which is trade, can run and we can transform our organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency Pitfield. Mr. President.
No, thank you. And it's indeed a very good question. And I think it's our shared responsibility, our collective responsibility to build trust. And I give you one very concrete example. I had the honor and the privilege to represent the EU a few weeks ago in Laos for the meeting of the ASEAN countries. And by the way, I had the opportunity to meet with your Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of Thailand. And I think that the personal relationships between the leaders is also an important element that we should not underestimate. This is very important to engage directly, not only to read files prepared by very good advisors, but to meet in person, to listen, to feel the atmosphere, to understand better what are the sensitivities, what are the priorities, what are maybe the red lines, what is maybe not possible today, but that could be possible in a few weeks, in a few months, because the landscape could be different in a few weeks, in a few months. I remember a Belgian politician with a lot of experience when I was much younger, who once told me, Charles, this is good to be right, but this is better to be right at the right moment. And it means that sometimes we need strategic patience. Sometimes we need to accept that maybe today this is too early, but with a bit more of time, it will be possible to achieve some goals. And that's why, again, I'm a bit obsessed by this idea that the regional organizations, they have an important role to play. If I take the example of ASEAN and the ambition to work together to improve the economic coordination, to improve the economic development in that region, I am certain this a first important step, this regional organization, for a multilateral approach. And based on it, when in ASEAN you coordinate so that you work to try to have more common positions on some fundamental challenges like climate change, like trade, like the digital revolution, like security and stability, then when you engage with other regions, not only with the EU, but also with other regions, this is an additional step so that we encourage a better mutual understanding, which is the basis for making decisions all together. And my third point, I think this is a very good example, and I was super pleased to be in the room of the General Assembly when it took place, before the start of the General Assembly, when we made this agreement on the Pact of the Future. in fact, we were taken by surprise, because probably a few weeks before this agreement, there was this impression that we would fail, that we would not manage to make an agreement. And then, because we decided to show our political will to act with tenacity, not to give up, to talk to each other, not to be divided, because the topics were extremely and are extremely important, we managed to make an agreement. And now we need to implement, and we need to make sure that it will become a reality. But good question, we need to rebuild trust. How can we do that? By talking to each other, by respecting each other, by accepting the idea that we will make better decisions if we take into account all the sensitivities around the table. And maybe I don't want to be too long, but maybe another example that I shared a few weeks ago with the Director General. I will give you a very concrete and interesting example in my opinion. The deforestation law. I know that in this room probably there are some countries very sensitive with this initiative launched by the European Union. I would like to explain to you. From Brussels, I can tell you that we have and we had good intentions, because we think biodiversity, climate change is serious, and we want to avoid a situation where in fact we would just made decisions which are important for ourselves on the EU side, but that would provoke, in fact, an effect outside of the EU without solving this climate change issue. And I was personally convinced this was the right choice. And despite the fact that I read some documents prepared by my team following which some countries were not happy with this idea, I was convinced it was the right idea. And then 3 years ago, I think 3 years ago, I had a meeting in the margin of the G20 with the president of Indonesia and with the Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. 20 minutes meeting in person with them. And in that meeting, I understood, in fact, the magnitude of the consequences for a country like Indonesia, palm oil, and I understood that, in fact, they need more time. We need more time. We need to see what we can do to make sure that this decision, with good intentions, is a decision that takes into account the legitimate concerns of our partners. I can tell the same for a country like Brazil. I can tell the same for a country like Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, with the cacao sector, etc., etc. And it's a concrete example that shows that we need to talk to each other, to listen to each other, to show respect to each other, and to accept that we are not perfect. Sometimes with good intentions we can make mistakes, but the big mistake is not to learn the lessons when we make a mistake. And this is a sign of being smart, when we are able to say, okay, here we need more time, we need to adapt, we need to correct. And here I'm talking on behalf of the EU, but it will be a domestic debate within the EU. European Parliament, governments, we do not have spontaneously the same idea about it. It will be a vibrant democratic debate, and we don't fear to have this debate. I'm showing what I think. I think that this is a good example where we have to learn some lessons, and that's why I'm pleased that you have decided to postpone. By the way, it was a good advice given by the Director General a few weeks ago, and we followed this advice.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Director General, do you want to add something?
That's a wonderful answer, but I'm learning a lot. Strategic patience and active listening.
Thank you so much. Now I turn to our colleague, Excellency Ambassador Baxter of Australia. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Director General, for setting up this event, and welcome to Geneva, President Michel. Thank you so much for your remarks. We appreciated, in particular, the reaffirmation of the European Union's commitment to tackle the many challenges we're facing through rules-based cooperation, and also through building opportunities for international trade. And I would say that those are sentiments that we see put into practice every week here by your team, your excellent team here in Brussels, led so ably by Ambassador Machado. We rely on the vital contribution that you make, and we look forward to seeing that continue. I was interested, though, in some of the remarks you made about regional cooperation, some of the regional efforts that the EU has made with other parts of the world. Since the WTO was established, of course, we've seen a proliferation of bilateral and regional free trade agreements. And I was wondering how you saw that sitting alongside the role of the multilateral trading system and the WTO. Thank you.
Yes. No, I think that what is important when we try to develop more bilateral agreements is to work to make sure that this is done in the framework of the principle fixed by the WTO, point one, and point two. I was also interested to understand how the WTO is working to develop this concept of plurilateral agreement. And it's an interesting idea, I think. And in fact, this is not far from a concept we are using at the European Union's level, what we call the strengthened cooperation. On some topics at the European Union's level, we understand that we do not have unanimity to coordinate more, to cooperate more in some fields, but we accept that those who would like, on a voluntary basis, to cooperate more, they are allowed to cooperate more. And very often what we can see is the fact that sooner or later, some other countries, which were not part at the beginning of this strengthened cooperation, they decide to join. And maybe they need more time, strategic patience, we have to accept that. And then they see the benefits. And when they see the benefits, they decide to move. That's why I think it's a great idea, a smart idea. I don't dare to say a Belgian idea because it's not a Belgian idea, but it's typically a Belgian approach. This is a joke, to make sure that there is no misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. I don't want to create a diplomatic incident with Belgium. But this is one first element. And my second element, in terms of trade deals, trade agreements, and WTO reforms, I think that we have a shared responsibility, and this is challenging. It's not easy. In fact, we are in a moment where we face more and more difficulties because the facts and figures are less than before the basis for the political debate. We face more and more complotist theories, populism, extremism, etc., etc. And I think we need also, all across the world, in our countries, to explain the benefits, to explain what we do, so that we have our people with us. I'm giving this example why? Because I can tell you that in Europe we have a challenge on that topic. Why? Because if in the past it was natural for us to develop more trade agreements, to be more active for open trade, for free market, etc., etc., I have observed, especially the last years, that it was more and more difficult to convince our people that this is the right choice for more prosperity. There are fears, there are impressions that this is dangerous, that the competition is not fair. And let me share another example. If there is a country we are very close within the EU, this is Canada. A few years ago, when I was Prime Minister of Belgium, we made an agreement with Canada. And we had huge difficulties just to confirm this agreement with Canada. And why I'm mentioning that? Because Canada, for sure, is a country with a lot of similar standards. This is not the most difficult country in principle, but even for a country with Canada, for making trade deals with Canada, it was very difficult to convince our domestic audience within the EU, including in Belgium. And it shows, in my opinion, that the decision-making process is important and that we should take care that from the beginning of the process, we inform, we explain our people, the public opinion, the national parliament, what we are doing so that they are not taken by surprise. And then when there is a proposal on the table that you are supposed to agree, that we do not face huge difficulties. It was the case very often in Europe. We try to learn the lessons and we try also to adapt our decision-making process so that we involve much more immediately the civil society, the national parliaments in the decision-making process. But again, for your first question, it should be in line with the WTO principles and rules, and then this is a good step in the right direction, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Director General?
This one, I have a very quick comment to add. It's just to say that, look, in an evolving modern world, we need more flexibility. And I think we need not be afraid of bilateral and regional agreements because we see that the bulk of trade is still done on WTO terms. But more importantly, as His Excellency said, if you look at those agreements, and we are a custodian of them at the WTO, we have a unit that looks they are built on WTO principles, so it's still fundamentally a good thing. And as long as we keep that in mind, build on WTO principles, they're supplementary or additional, I think it's good. But on plurilaterals, I really wanted to say that in this modern world, I like what I heard. I didn't know that you also had this approach in the EU, that when you cannot get unanimity, a group can start, and then the others. I didn't know that. So I'm learning a lot today. I think that's the way to go in a world that is fast evolving. If you don't have some variety of instruments to deal with situations, it means you're left behind. And by the time you get everybody to agree, the issue is passé. So I really think we need at the WTO to think of how to keep modern and flexible with multiple approaches that do not take away from the fundamental best instrument we have, which is the multilateral instrument. That is still the priority, but we shouldn't let it get in the way of being able to be responsive. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Director General. Now, is there any other question on the floor? We are coming to the tail end of this segment. Is that please? Go ahead. Introduce yourself
Thank you,
first.
Excellencies. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of ISO, International Standards Organization. Thanks for treating this very important topic with depth, candidness, and a little bit of humor. It's very appreciated in these very serious meetings. But what I wanted to ask the President is, when you talk about trust, what's the role, if you believe that there is a role, and what would be the role of these technical and scientific collaboration platforms? And if so, what would be your recommendation to us to take back to the many partners and experts and scientists that work with us on those issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I think that this is a very important topic, but what we face in many countries across the world, on all continents, I think, this is the idea that some are trying to develop arguments which are not based anymore on scientific base, on facts and figures. And this is the difference between reality and perception of the reality. And I think this is a threat for rebuilding trust, because I think that we can only build trust if the starting point is the fact that we can take into account some facts, figures, and scientific data, scientific information that should be the basis for a fruitful conversation, for a fruitful global dialogue. I don't want to give examples, but there are apparently elections very soon in some countries across the world, and we can see the evolution of the democratic debate, the evolution of the political debate, with this impression that it's more and more difficult to have a normal exchange of views, a normal political debate based on facts and figures, because more and more we can see that the perception, the impression seem to be more important than the reality. And this is a threat, I think, for the global dialogue, for the global political cooperation, for the multilateral approach. And that's why I think that the experts, the science, they have a very important role to play, so that they are very vocal to say this is the basis on which the political debate, and the political debate, it allows to have different opinions. We may have different opinions, different ideas about what is the best way to tackle climate change, what is the best way to solve this geopolitical problem, but it should be based on the idea that we trust data, we trust scientific information.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're almost out of time. Is there one more last question that somebody wants to ask? Please. And then we'll take that as the last question. Please proceed and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I was saving the last for the best. This is Ambassador Ali Hussain from, I'm the Pakistan's ambassador to WTO. Let me start first of all by thanking and congratulating the Secretariat and the DG for organizing this series. And Excellency President, thank you very much for your insightful comments on trade and on all the contemporary issues. My question is, we have a COP29 coming up in about 7-8 days. And you have pointed out that environment is a very complex issue. And at times it seems that multilateral organizations are working in silos. And the issue of environment, which you have mentioned, is very complex. How these organizations such as WTO and UN and all other entities working on environment can work together in order to achieve the common outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Once again, I would like to make a parallelism with my experience on the EU side. It's not exactly the same, but on the EU side, sometimes we face the same challenges, and sometimes there is this temptation to work in silos and to follow a very vertical approach and not to take into account the broad picture. And this is what we need to do. And I think the next meeting that will take place in Azerbaijan is one more occasion to try to have a look at the global picture and the broad picture so that we are certain that we are all in the same boat and that we all follow the same goals and the same purposes. And that each of one, we use the tools we have in our hands to try to make steps in the right direction, and that what we do is consistent with what our friends and colleagues are doing on their side. And COP29 is a good occasion, I think, for this global dialogue, for the state of play, and to see what are the next steps. And then, if you would ask me, I would tell you that, in my opinion, the next COP that will take place in Azerbaijan should be the occasion to discuss seriously about the most important thing, which is money. The promises, do we deliver on the promises we made? And let's be clear, let's be transparent. Again, fact and figures, because it's one thing to make promises, to send a communique. This is something different to disburse. And the EU doesn't fear this debate, because I think that if many other developed countries or developed regions would follow the example of the EU, there would be much more money to address this crisis and much more support for those who need more money. And I think that the COP29 will be one more occasion to be serious about this question of financing. And it's not only about public money, it's also about private money. How can we make sure that public money is used as a leverage to encourage more private financing to address this goal? And how can we build and support business models which are environmentally friendly?
Yeah, thank you. Madam Director General.
Just to add very quickly to that, I do want to agree that we find we are working in silos very often. And I think the issue of financing is one where the multilateral organizations can come together to try to see how they leverage off their collective balance sheet. And they're trying to do that. And trade is also part of it. I always remind them, sometimes you may have money, but if someone throws an export restriction in front of you, you can't get access to the goods and services. So you mustn't forget the non-financial issues. But even on the issue of carbon pricing, I'll just share the experience we found. When we started looking, when we got a lot of complaints, about CBAM, where many developing countries and emerging markets felt this was just a measure to keep their goods out. I'll just be very frank about it. And we started looking at, wow, all we are going to get here is a whole slew of litigation and complaints and disputes and requests for consultation. We better start thinking, how do you deal with this? And we started thinking what is the approach, from the research side and so on. And then we started thinking through and trying to talk to some of our members about it. But then I found that the IMF was doing the same work. The World Bank was doing this, trying to find a global approach that would answer this question and take us out of fragmentation. So here were three international organizations worrying about the same thing and starting a stream of work in parallel. And I found this out when I went for one of the annual meetings that we had. So I started talking to the heads, why are we all? Actually, the International Maritime Organization is also doing. So here are 4 or 5 multilateral organizations. So why are we all working in parallel, trying to solve the same problem? Maybe we should put the brain power we have if we all think this is a genuine thing that needs to be cracked. So that's how we came to start cooperating and collaborating on the issue of carbon pricing and how to approach it. And I think it's a better way. It is an OECD. It's so difficult. I can see why we don't collaborate, because the task force is very difficult to work. But somehow we're managing to do it, and I think that that is the right way to go if we want to serve the world in the better way. Put all our brains together to try and come up with approaches that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam DG. This ends this segment of the Q&A and questions from the floor. Now, Mr. President, your final thoughts before we draw the curtain.
I just want to say thank you. It was really great to meet with you, to have this exchange of views. And again, I would like to tell all of you that you can count on the EU. I'm very confident that this political project is a very sincere political project, and we would like to be a positive force for change and for rebuilding trust. And once again, I congratulate you on all your efforts in a difficult context, and you can count on us.
Thank you. Madam Director General.
Well, thank you. I'm supposed to deliver closing remarks, but I'm not. Because we're out of time, I just simply want to thank His Excellency, Mr. President. It's been an absolute, I've learned so many things myself. That's part of this presidential lecture. I want to thank our members for showing up and supporting this series and for all the work. They're the ones that do the work. It's a member-driven organization. We can only come behind with some of our simple thoughts about how to move things forward. So I do want to thank them, to thank all our friends from the outside community for being here, and say it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. I want to thank Professor Carr, as usual, for all the tough questions that he drew up. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful lunch.
Thank you. Thank you.